Hey, I'm Angelo Pinto, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. Mark Levine is sounding the alarm about a massive deficit in New York City. But let's be clear, whose crisis is this really? Because every time we hear this language, it's usually a setup for cuts, a setup for austerity, and a setup for shifting the burden onto working people. Now, at the same time, there's a growing push to tax the rich, and rightfully so, because you cannot talk about deficits without talking about revenue. You cannot talk about budget gaps without talking about who benefits from the current system and who's been left out of it. But here's where it gets even more real, because while they're debating deficits and tax policy, Black New Yorkers are still dealing with disproportionate unemployment. And that is not an accident. That is a policy failure. And let me say this clearly, addressing employment for Black New Yorkers is doable. It is not some abstract dream. The national average shows us what's possible. The question is, do we have the political will to invest in job creation, workforce development, and real economic access? Like the great hip-hop group Wu-Tang Clan said in their famous song, "Cash rules everything around me, cream get the money, dollar dollar bill, y'all." Here to discuss that cream is New York City Comptroller Mark Levine. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip. So Mark, thank you for being on the show. We're gonna jump right into it. So the mayor said initially, I think there was like a $12 billion deficit, then maybe 8, and now down to 5, he found money. For most New Yorkers, we just have to kind of rely on what folks are saying to know whether or not it's true. But as the comptroller, you kind of know these numbers in a very intimate way. Where are we with the deficit? What's real, what's not?
Angela, first, thank you so much for having me on the show, and congrats on the success of Let It Rip. People are talking about it. You're doing something really important here.
Thank you.
I'm honored to be here. And I liked your introduction. I might have to use Cream as my walk-on song. We'll see.
Never know.
Look, the truth is we do have a budget problem. And I know it feels like a moving target. When I became comptroller in January, I wanted to call it out. And I announced that we have determined we have a $12 billion budget gap, which is big.
Huge.
And the mayor did something that I think is impressive. He didn't try and deny it. He didn't try and say that I was making numbers up. He said, yeah, we have a budget deficit. And I'm not sure another mayor would have done that. And that allowed us as a city to start to grapple with it, to start to look at the expenses and the income and find solutions. We had, in the interim, the best Wall Street bonus season that the city's ever had, almost $50 billion in Wall Street bonuses. And so that meant a lot more money for our coffers because we get personal income tax from all that. So that chipped away at some of the deficit. And then Governor Hochul, about 6 or 8 weeks ago, put some additional money on the table for the city, about $1.7 billion, which chipped away at it even more. And now the mayor's put a proposal, his actual preliminary budget proposal, which does get us to balance. Now, it includes a property tax increase, which I don't think anyone probably
People aren't very fond of that.
No, look, it's a very unequitable system. It has a higher tax rate for a homeowner in East New York than it does for a homeowner in Park Slope. So why would you want to increase?
And before we dive into that, because
please.
that's a very important issue a lot of folks are talking about, you mentioned this dance that happens between, of course, the administration and the comptroller's office trying to balance the budget and make up for some of this deficit. Is this something that always happens, or is it unique to this particular kind of administration, or is this generally something that happens with the comptroller?
We partly are in this mess because in the last administration, there were some expenses that were growing very fast that the previous mayor did not adequately budget for.
Which expenses were those?
We have a voucher program, something like a city version of Section 8 called City FEPS, which is very important for getting families out of homeless shelters. Angelo, it's growing by 4% a month. It's going to hit $2.5 billion next year, and it was not budgeted for that. So that's a big gap that the current mayor inherited. We have, you know what Carter cases are when your child in the public school has to sue to get special services in a private school? That's going to hit $1.5 billion next year. These are growing, and they were not in the budget in the previous administration. And we called it out. And the new mayor said, you know what? You're right. Those are real expenses, and they're growing. And that's allowed us now to have this conversation about how we close the gap, which are not easy solutions. It's never easy to close a budget gap. Thankfully, though, New York's economy is actually overall still growing, and our tax revenue is growing, sales tax, property tax, income tax. So this is not a disaster. We just have to be smarter about the budget. And as you have said eloquently, make sure we don't balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable.
So there may be some common sense things that can happen, as you mentioned, that the last administration didn't really do or cause some aspects of the budget to balloon. But I guess for many folks now, it's how do you actually begin to balance the budget? Does this happen through increasing property taxes? Or like some folks are saying, do you create taxes on the rich to make up some of this ground? What's your position on those two things? Of course, property taxes are never popular with folks. No. How do you think the ground gets made up, if it can be made up?
I think it can. We are going to need more help from Albany. New York City sends billions more to Albany every year than we get back. It's never been a fair formula. We want more of our fair share. We're going to have to find some savings and efficiencies in government and do it in a way that protects vital services to people in need. And in a budget of $127 billion, believe me, there are places that we can cut that are not going to impact the most vulnerable. I believe that. I don't think we should raise property taxes. I don't think even the mayor thinks we should raise property taxes. We want to avoid that. And as for increasing taxes on the rich, that is on the table. It's in both the one house budgets of the Senate and the Assembly, and it should be considered. I want to make sure that we don't undermine some of the job growth that we need in the city that I know we're going to talk about, which is also disproportionately impacting Black and brown New Yorkers. So it's a bit of a balancing act. We do want the economy to grow, so we have the tax revenue to invest in these programs.
And as you mentioned, that New York economy is doing pretty good, and probably the place that has seen the most kind of success is Wall Street.
Yeah.
They've seen tremendous growth, tremendous gains. And I think a lot of folks are saying that, let's be equitable there too. What are your thoughts and feelings around that? Do you think it makes sense, or do you feel like it drives business away from the city and we have to be careful about how we do that?
Look, in the midst of good economic news, which I just spoke about, there is one challenge, which is we're not really adding jobs. We are not adding jobs in New York.
Creation.
And that is falling disproportionately on Black and brown New Yorkers. The unemployment rate among Black New Yorkers is 9%, Latino New Yorkers 7%, which is more than double white New Yorkers. And this is rising, particularly for young people. And if you talk to a young person who did the right thing and went to college and got a degree and came back to New York, and they can't find an apartment they can afford, and they can't find a good entry-level job, and that's really a problem. So we want to keep our eyes on growing the job base. And as for Wall Street, they should pay more. We want to make sure, though, that in the process, we don't increase the pace of firms departing to places like Texas, which is happening. And JP Morgan Chase just built a big new tower on Park Avenue. You've probably seen it. But JP Morgan Chase has more employees in Texas now than it does in New York. So we don't want to accelerate that trend. So it's a bit of a balancing act. The truth is, we did raise taxes on the wealthy in 2021, and there was no mass exodus. And a lot of people are looking at that and saying, okay, we can
do this again.
Yeah, but others say it's a little bit different now. People are more mobile. And so I think there's some unknowns there. These are things that I'm watching closely.
And in terms of the piece you mentioned around this employment, right? Unemployment, particularly for Black communities, which of course New York City we're seeing spikes, but across the country we're seeing spikes, which directly impacts, wealth for Black families and Black communities. What's the comptroller's responsibility, if any, around addressing that? How do you see this employment issue being addressed in the coming years or months? What's your plan around all those things?
Honestly, this job stuff keeps me up at night, Angelo. It's not only New York, it's national too. I think it's worse here. It has hit the Black community particularly hard. It is jobs lost in the federal government from Trump's very harmful cuts, which have disproportionately impacted Black federal workers and Black women in the federal workforce. We have a very large federal workforce in New York City. It's not only DC. In the corporate sector, it is the attack on diversity programs and the staffing for those programs, which has disproportionately impacted Black women again. And I do want to say on the record that diverse organizations are not just doing the right thing, they are also more successful as businesses. So to me, it's crazy that we're undermining this. And then you have some of the broader challenges in the economy with the tariffs and all the impact that's having. Now this horrible war, which is pumping up inflation and also hurting our economy. So we have a lot of challenges here.
We're going to shift a little bit with the time we have. Reparations. Do you see reparations bridging this kind of economic gap that exists, particularly in black communities, addressing some of the wealth issues? What are your thoughts on kind of all things reparations in New York City?
This is a very, very important issue, and I'm very proud that New York is pushing on this, and we are ahead of most other states. And thank you to the colleagues who led on this. And it's possible that this could actually be the thing that drives the kind of investments we're talking about, and once and for all, really investing in affordability and good schools and the kinds of economic supports that people need now in this very difficult time. So I'm excited to hear how this process goes. And again, I'm proud that New York is leading on this.
And in terms of like we're seeing now, affordability crisis, chronic unemployment, and one of the things that reparations seeks to do, of course, is address the historic harm. Do you think that's also an important piece, as well as kind of bridging the wealth gap, honoring kind of the harm that has been done?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a legacy of racism in housing policy
Certainly.
That is well documented. In home ownership, where we had something called redlining.
Certainly.
Certainly a long history of racial discrimination in rental housing, which unfortunately continues to this day. And we need to take that into account when we develop our policies to address it. We have a long legacy of racial inequality in our housing market, in employment, in education, in criminal justice, that we have to take into account as we make our policies to address that inequality.
Great conversation. I'd like to thank New York City Comptroller Mark Levine for his insight. We will stay on top of these important issues. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll discuss the state of education in New York City. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip. Let's talk about the state of education in New York City, because right now it's not just about test scores or funding, it's about culture, climate, and how black students are being treated in these spaces. In a recent viral video featuring CUNY professor has put a spotlight on anti-blackness in New York City school system. And let's be clear, this is not an isolated incident. This is a window into a deeper systemic issue that too many students, families, and educators have been calling out for years. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because this moment demands more than outrage. It demands structural change. Here to discuss is former New York City Chancellor Meisha Porter, former principal and New York City Council member Inez Barron, and education policy expert and organizer Matt Gonzales. So folks, let's dive right into it. As we mentioned, these structural issues, particularly around race in the public education across New York City, New York State, how do we address it? What are your thoughts on it? Let's just dive in.
Well, I think if you asked any of us, the video that we all saw, heartbreaking, but not surprising. And I think that's the starting point. Why in 2026 are we not surprised about these moments in public education spaces where we are having conversations about policy and making decisions about New York City's public school students? And so I think for me, the biggest thing was heartbreaking that this is happening in our city, but not surprising.
And can we change it? Because year after year, you see these kind of videos that happen that impact students and sometimes becomes normalized. Can we change the culture that exists so that these things don't happen in the future?
I think it's important that we understand that that's a reflection of what it is. And until there's a level of consciousness, a level of acknowledging that it exists, in an expression rather, where people in power can make changes that other people have to institute, it's going to continue to be below the surface or, oh, that's horrible, but continuing to happen. So we've got to understand, we've got to have the ability to have the power to make people change because they know there are going to be consequences. When there are no consequences, we're talking about, oh, that's horrible. But what happened?
That's a great point.
Yes.
Well, I think that this really represents, first of all, this also happened during Black History Month. And it's
Yes.
why is this happening in this month, right? But this is a persistent problem we see, right? I think that there are, variety of kind of ways that this manifests from folks who I believe think they have really good intentions. But, the city had once invested, actually under our former chancellor, had invested a lot in implicit bias educational
Yes.
work for our
Yes.
educators. And so within that, that's doing some heart and culture work that really needs to happen, and some self-reflection that educators across the country, especially in New York City, should be doing. And there needs to be some systems of accountability. You know, I'm just speaking for the K-12 system. At the CUNY system, I know it's a much different kind of context, but you know, I think that this is representative that we have faculty at the higher ed and the K-12 level who harbor problematic ideologies, and that there are not a lot of ways to hold them accountable, right? And again, I don't think kind of ousting, kind of like pitchforking someone around this is like the right thing. Like, there's education, but I do think accountability does mean consequences, right? And I think that we don't have systems for that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And of course, it was a CUNY professor, not necessarily at a CUNY
Right.
institution. But that's a good point. What do other folks think about, like, removing folks who we know have a predisposition to things that are not good for students or are anti-Black? Do we think they should be removed? Do we think that sends a message that this will not be tolerated and something new should happen?
I think this should be removed, yes, because if you're representing an institution that talks about, oh, we feel that there should be equity, we feel that there should be the opportunity, although CUNY is not where, well, this is a CUNY program, right?
I think
So, you know, I was the chair of higher education at CUNY, and CUNY had dismal numbers of Black faculty in significant positions. Dismal. I don't know that it's changed much in 4 years, but so people are going to say, well, CUNY says one thing, but their policies and the consequences for people who violate what they say are their policies.
say another thing.
Yes, very different.
And I think there are, I think Matt raised also, right? Like, they're also, we work in systems with unions that have protections, right? Like, that's just real. So what can happen and can't happen, like, CUNY's got to figure that out. But the reality is there can be consequences. There can be expectations, right? Like the implicit bias, right? Courageous conversations about race. You can't eliminate everyone who is in disagreement, right? Like if
Maybe
it
a
was
few.
easy, a few should, right? Like there's some real hard decisions that you have to make sometimes. However, if there aren't structures in place that address the biases that exist, then just eliminating one person and one voice won't solve the problem. And one other thing that's really important about CUNY in this is CUNY also produces many teachers who go into our K-12 system. And so if the folks in front of them have a set of beliefs, then who then are we sending in front of our children?
And it's interesting because this question around even training implicit bias and how do you actually tackle this issue, it makes me think about policing. And for a long time, folks were saying, training, this is going to help. And we're like, no. Training does not change racist attitudes of police officers. So I think the other question is, how do you really get a handle on this issue and impact it? Does implicit bias training actually begin to shift folks who may be racist, and this is what they choose to do? They may not do it publicly. How do you really begin to shift, particularly a thing that, as we all mentioned, has been going on for a long time, decades, has a history in this country, is deeply rooted? Can you shift that without a real system overhaul, or maybe, I don't know?
No, there has to be, right? Training is a start, right? Like, training is only
Does
a
it
start.
work, though? Does training really work?
It works with systems of accountability,
That's
right?
it.
Like, it doesn't work if you just send me to the training to learn the thing, but there's nothing I'm expected to do with it. There's no practice I'm expected to change. There are no consequences if I don't. Then it's just then it's an effort and compliance.
So training coupled with real system accountability
Absolutely.
potentially could have impact.
Consequences. You did it. Here's a matrix that will tell you what consequence you can expect when you create these kinds of actions.
What are the ramifications for your actions?
Yeah, and look, I think that like the training alone, as former Chancellor said, is not sufficient. It's necessary, right? I was trained as a teacher, and I was trained in culturally responsive education and restorative practices. Those are things I brought into my classroom. Did I every single day execute that perfectly? No, of course not, right? Like, I made mistakes. I think we need to build a culture that's not reliant on punishment, but accountability, right? So that we actually are like, if you were explicitly racist, we should find a way to exit you from this institution, right? And if you make a statement or do something problematic, I think we need to really try to hold folks through that process, right? So that we don't say when you make a mistake, and we don't teach young people that when they make a mistake, we just remove them from the community, right? And I think the difference with the context around the NYPD or policing is that is a system that has little to no accountability structures embedded in. Any of the ones that have been created have been really about to continue funding that system.
And across education, you feel like there are more systems of accountability?
When I was at, previously was at NYU Metro Center, I had the privilege to work with over 100 schools, 300, 400 educators that were part of equity teams across the system, and we did deep, powerful work with them, right? That work was eventually cut by the Adams administration, but I saw tremendous progress, right?
And
they
real
were building
impact.
plans, they were building structures, they were building capacity to do right by our communities, and I think there's space.
And I
to
want
do that.
I think, let me just jump in
Yes,
quickly. I think that accountability does in fact mean consequences.
Yeah, of course.
That's why I talk about a matrix. You know, some people were gonna, okay, you shouldn't have done that, let me help you change. But there's some things that are so egregious,
Totally.
you know.
You got to go.
You gotta go.
I want to talk a little bit. I mean, this training piece also speaks to, excuse me, the curriculum piece, right?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, what does curriculum look like? How does it impact students? And even how does curriculum impact those who are teaching it, who are tasked with dispensing it? But I also want to talk about this mayoral control piece. You know, what do we do about it? Sounds like you all have some thoughts
Well,
about
yeah.
this. Should it change?
I think it should, because the people, the community has no input. It's what the mayor wants. We've had some really bad examples, horrendous examples of chancellors who were selected because the mayor selects that under mayoral control. So you get someone like Joel Klein, who wasn't even qualified to teach. He didn't have
Let
teaching
alone be the
experience or
chancellor.
credentials. How can you be the chancellor? How can you, as a chancellor, walk into a teaching environment and not know what to look for? What are the cues? What are the things that you might want to recommend as difference? So he wasn't qualified to be a teacher. He certainly couldn't evaluate or help superintendents or understand what superintendents were doing when they were evaluating teachers. And of course, we had, for a hot minute, Kathy Black, who stuck her tongue out at other parents, you know, in a public setting.
And Ms. Porter, as a former
They had
chancellor,
to get waivers from the state education department to become chancellors.
I didn't need a waiver.
but as,
Experience.
yes.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
as a former
Yes.
chancellor, what are your thoughts about this mayoral control piece? Do you think it needs to change?
I
How
do.
quickly? Yeah.
I do, because I have been very blessed to recognize the value of community voice in leading, whether it was as a principal, superintendent, executive superintendent, or chancellor. That should not be at the decision of who sits in the seat. That has to be an expectation that the mayor, the PEP, that the bodies are working with the folks that we actually work in service of. And so there absolutely needs to be changes. There needs to be a real level of community engagement that's a part of the conversation of what it means to lead our schools.
And how do we get community to get more engaged?
Our friends are out there just waiting for somebody to pick up the phone and call them. I mean, the work, I'm gonna let Matt talk about his own work, but like the work that parents did this summer, having conversations all across New York City about what they expected and wanted of the next administration, of the mayor, of the chancellor.
But I think even bridging that gap, because I
Yeah.
know communities certainly want better education. They know that there's usually something missing for their students, particularly Black communities. But bridging the gap for them to understand mayoral control plays a role in what happens in your community around education. How do you begin to
But
bridge
they
that
understand
gap?
that. We underestimate that they don't understand that. They know who the decision makers are. That's why they show up where the mayor is, because they know he's the decision maker. So when somebody wants something, when I was chancellor, you know, I had parents following me and Mayor de Blasio all over the city to get what they want.
So then I guess maybe the question is, how do you get power to listen? Because if communities
Yeah.
and families are saying, hey, listen, we know who you are, we know you have the power, we want you to do something different, and something still doesn't happen, how do you get to bridge that gap?
Yeah, well, I want to just also say, like, there's this kind of discussion around mayoral control as if it's a binary. It's like it's either mayoral control or not.
Right.
Right now, the first version of mayoral control is not what we have right now. It's evolved away from that towards something not quite as community designed or community controlled as we would like it. But I would say, there's examples of doing deep public engagement that, former Chancellor Porter and I did around school diversity and integration that engage students, that engage parents in a meaningful, authentic way, right? So I think that, we also need to note that the systems that have mayoral control across the United States are primarily black and brown, majority systems, are systems that are serving low-income communities. So it is, I think towards the democratic kind of principle there, it is divesting the voices of black and brown families who are the majority in this system from making decisions. I do think that there is some deep public education we can and should be doing around like how the system works, because New York City does have a fairly complicated system, but it is not radically complicated that folks don't understand their community education council, the panel for educational policy. Most places in the country have an elected school board. I think we need something more co-governance driven so that we can hold districts and communities accountable for doing right by our families, right? Because that needs to happen. And we also need to make sure that students, parents, educators have a real voice in the process.
And I think mayoral control does not allow for that.
Definitely.
So I think, it doesn't need to be reformed or reshaped. We need to get rid of it and come up with something different. I think even if we carry that name on with it, it's going to bring a lot of baggage with it. And New York City is the only, entity in New York
It's
State.
unique.
Exactly.
I wish we had more time to discuss this, but we have to wrap the segment. Thank you all for your thoughts. Powerful and needed conversation. I'd like to thank our guests. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, I'll share my thoughts around this crisis on deed theft. I'm Angelo Pinto. This is Let It Rip. We need to talk about deed theft because one of the most silent and devastating ways black wealth is being stripped in real time, families who have held onto property for generations are losing it, not through sale, not through choice, but through fraud, forgery, and legal loopholes that are being exploited every single day. So the response has to be real. Stronger legal protections, community education, proactive monitoring and property records, and a collective action to defend what we own. Check your deeds, protect your family assets, and make sure our communities are informed. Because what we don't know can cost us everything. This is about defense, but it's also about vision. How do we not only protect black land, but expand it? That's the work, that's the mission. I'm Angelo Pinto, and this is Let It Rip.